They're going to kill me for this." Jake's weathered hands trembled as he lifted the crying Apache infant from the woven basket on his doorstep, knowing full well that saving this child's life might cost him his own. By dawn, 50 painted warriors would encircle his humble cabin, their silence more terrifying than war cries, demanding answers he didn't have. But sometimes doing what's right means facing impossible odds. And Jake was about to discover that courage isn't measured by the size of your enemy, but by the size of your heart. The infant's skin burned like desert sand under the merciless sun, yet his tiny lips had turned the pale blue of winter sky. And Jake's calloused fingers found a pulse so faint it seemed more prayer than heartbeat. Death was winning this battle, minute by precious minute, and every second Jake hesitated was another step closer to a grave, too small for any soul to bear. He scooped the bundle into his arms, feeling the terrible lightness of a life slipping away, and kicked open the cabin door with more force than necessary, as if anger could somehow chase away the inevitability pressing down on them both. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and leather gave way to something more urgent as Jake cleared his kitchen table with one sweeping motion, sending tin cups and yesterday's newspapers crashing to the floor in a symphony of desperation. His wife's quilt, the one she'd sewn during long winter evenings when hope still lived in this cabin, now became a cocoon of warmth around this dying stranger's child, the faded blue fabric wrapping around brown skin like sky embracing earth. Jake's hands moved with practiced efficiency, born of frontier necessity, crushing willow bark between his palms for fever, mixing honey with water for strength, while his mind raced through possibilities that all led to the same dark conclusion. Someone had placed this basket on his doorstep with deliberate intent, knowing full well that saving an Apache child would paint a target on Jake's back larger than any man should have to carry, and the weight of that realization settled into his bones like winter cold that never quite leaves. But as he looked down at the infant's face, peaceful now in unconsciousness, Jake's vision blurred not with tears of fear but with the memory of another small face, another fight against death that he had lost 5 winters ago when his own son slipped away despite every prayer, every remedy, every desperate bargain he had offered to God. The ghost of that failure haunted every gentle touch he now gave this Apache child, every spoonful of medicine, every whispered word of encouragement, because Jake understood with brutal clarity that some battles choose you rather than the other way around. Tonight, with 50 warriors surely watching from the darkness beyond his windows, Jake had become the thin line between life and death for a child whose very existence challenged everything the territory believed about enemies and allies. And the terrible beauty of it was that he no longer cared about the consequences, only about the steady rise and fall of tiny lungs that proved miracles still happened in a world gone mad with hatred. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. The hours crawled by like wounded animals seeking shelter, each minute marked by the soft rhythm of Jake's weathered voice humming melodies that had once filled this cabin with joy, back when Sarah's laughter danced between these walls and the future held promises instead of ghosts. He kept one eye on the infant's chest, watching for the steady rise and fall that meant life was winning its battle against death, while his other eye swept the darkness beyond frost-covered windows where shapes seemed to shift and breathe among the pine trees like living shadows waiting for dawn's judgment. The baby's fever had broken sometime after midnight, tiny fingers uncurling from desperate fists as peaceful sleep replaced the restless thrashing of pain, and Jake found himself leaning close to whisper words that surprised him with their fierce certainty. "You're safe now, little one," he murmured against the child's dark hair, knowing even as he spoke that safety was a luxury neither of them could afford in a world where the color of your skin determined whether you lived or died. "I won't let them hurt you," he promised. Though his rifle stood ready against the wall and his ammunition was limited, because some vows transcend logic and plant themselves in the soul where reason cannot uproot them. Outside, the familiar symphony of night sounds, the owl's haunting call, the rustle of small creatures in underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes, had fallen silent as if the very wilderness held its breath in anticipation of what morning would bring. Jake caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that seemed too deliberate to be branches swaying in the wind, too purposeful to be deer moving through their ancient paths, and he understood with growing certainty that they were no longer alone in this remote corner of the territory. The watchers had come, as he knew they would, drawn by the scent of their stolen child and the need for answers that only blood could provide. Yet Jake felt no fear, only a strange sense of rightness that settled over him like his wife's old shawl. Every instinct screamed at him to bundle the child and flee into the night, to disappear into the mountains where armies could not follow. But something deeper than survival kept him rooted to this place, this moment, this choice between the easy path of self-preservation and the harder road of doing what his conscience demanded. As the infant stirred and made soft sounds of contentment, Jake realized he had already crossed a line from which there could be no return, had already chosen to stand between innocence and the world's cruelty regardless of the cost, because some battles are not about winning or losing, but about who you choose to be when everything you value hangs in the balance. The sun climbed over the eastern ridge like a judge ascending his bench, casting long shadows across the clearing that suddenly revealed what Jake had sensed through the dark hours. 50 Apache warriors mounted on paint horses that stood motionless as carved stone, their riders draped in morning mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself like spirits materializing from another world. Not one weapon pointed in his direction, yet the threat hung in the air thick as smoke from a distant fire, each lance and rifle held ready but not raised, creating a tableau of restrained power that could explode into violence with the twitch of a single muscle. Jake stepped onto his porch slowly, the bundled infant cradled against his chest like a shield made of hope and desperation, his boots creaking on weathered planks that suddenly seemed to echo across the entire valley with the weight of destiny settling into place. 30 yards of dusty ground stretched between him and the lead warrior, a distance that felt both impossibly far and dangerously close, while 50 pairs of dark eyes studied his every movement with the intensity of men who had ridden through the night seeking either justice or vengeance. The lead warrior sat his horse with the stillness of granite carved by wind and time, his face painted with red and black stripes that spoke of mourning and war, his gaze locked on Jake's with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through flesh and bone to examine the contents of a man's soul. Jake felt the morning air crackle with potential violence, understood that one wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, could turn this clearing into a battlefield where his blood would water the earth alongside that of warriors who had come seeking something more precious than gold or glory. Yet something in the quality of their stillness, the way they held their weapons ready but not threatening, told him this was not an ambush but a test, a moment suspended between two possible futures where honor would determine which path they all walked together. The visual struck him with its terrible beauty. One weathered cowboy in faded denim standing against 50 mounted warriors whose ancestors had ruled these mountains for countless generations. The contrast so stark it seemed, pulled from the pages of some impossible legend where David faced not one giant, but an army of them. But as Jake looked into the lead warrior's eyes, he saw not hatred, but something far more complex, a mixture of grief and desperate hope that mirrored his own feelings. As he held this child, who had already changed the course of all their lives, the infant stirred in his arms, making soft sounds that carried across the morning stillness like a prayer offered to whatever gods watched over impossible moments, when enemies must choose whether to become something greater than their hatred. Time stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, and Jake understood that the next words spoken would either open a door to understanding or close it forever with the finality of gunfire and death. The lead warrior's moccasins touched earth with the silence of falling snow. His dismount from the painted stallion so fluid it seemed like water flowing from one vessel to another, while his warriors remained frozen in their saddles like sentinels carved from the mountain stone itself. Chief Two Eagles moved across the dusty ground with deliberate steps that spoke of a man walking the razor's edge between rage and relief, his weathered face a battlefield where controlled fury warred against desperate hope, as his eyes fixed on the bundle in Jake's arms and saw the gentle rise and fall that meant his world had not ended after all. Jake instinctively extended the infant toward the approaching chief, offering the child like a bridge across the chasm of hatred that separated their peoples. But Two Eagles raised one scarred hand to stop him, palm forward in a gesture that commanded attention and demanded answers before reconciliation could even be considered. The chief's voice, when it finally came, carried the weight of mountains and the pain of generations, his broken English falling into the morning stillness like stones dropped into still water, each word creating ripples that would determine whether this encounter ended in bloodshed or understanding. "You could have left him to die," Two Eagles said, his dark eyes searching Jake's face for signs of deception or hidden motives, the unspoken question hanging between them like smoke from a sacred fire that could either purify or consume everything it touched. "Why did you choose to save him, knowing what it would cost you, knowing that your people and mine have been enemies since the first white man crossed these mountains, seeking gold and glory at the expense of Apache blood?" Jake felt the weight of that question settle into his bones like winter cold, understood that his answer would be weighed not just by this chief, but by 50 warriors who had ridden through darkness, seeking either their lost child or vengeance for his death. Their loyalty to Two Eagles absolute, but their patience wearing thin as morning shadows shortened. The chief's internal struggle played across his features like clouds racing across the face of the sun, gratitude for his grandson's survival battling against suspicion that this might be some elaborate trap designed to lower Apache defenses before delivering a killing blow. Two Eagles had seen too many treaties broken, too many promises turned to lies, too many white men speak of peace while their hands reached for weapons. And yet here stood one man who had risked everything to save an Apache child when leaving him to die would have been easier, safer, and entirely expected by both sides of this bloody conflict. The tension stretched between them like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point, 50 pairs of eyes watching from horseback as their chief sought truth in the face of a man who had already proven himself capable of defying expectations, while Jake held the living proof of his choice and waited for judgment that could come in the form of gratitude or a warrior's blade. The infant stirred against Jake's chest, small sounds of contentment that seemed impossibly loud in the charged silence, a reminder that innocence existed in a world gone mad with hatred, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to let that innocence perish on your watch. Jake's voice emerged rough as sandpaper against wood, carrying the weight of memories that had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair the color of winter frost before its time, as he spoke words that came from the deepest well of his pain, where truth lived alongside the ghosts of what might have been. "I found him dying on my doorstep, fever burning him up from the inside, and I couldn't just walk away because 5 years ago I stood beside another small grave and swore I'd never let another child die if I had the power to save him," Jake said, his voice breaking on the admission that he had failed once before, when his own son slipped away from pneumonia despite every prayer and remedy he could muster. "My boy Thomas would be 7 now if the sickness hadn't taken him, would be learning to ride and helping with the cattle, and when I saw your grandson fighting for breath, I saw my Thomas all over again, saw another chance to do what I couldn't do then." Two Eagles listened with the stillness of stone carved by wind and time, his painted face revealing nothing while his soul absorbed every word like dry earth drinking rain, understanding that grief was a language spoken by all men regardless of the color of their skin or the gods they called upon in their darkest hours. The chief's response came slowly, each word measured and heavy with its own burden of loss, his broken English somehow making the pain more raw and immediate as he revealed the source of his own anguish that had driven him across mountain and desert, seeking either his grandson or vengeance for his death. 3 days ago, soldiers came like wolves in the night, he said, his hands clenching into fists that trembled with barely contained rage, burning our lodges and shooting anyone who tried to stop them from taking the children, and my daughter, running deer, threw herself between their guns and her baby, her blood watering the earth as she died, trying to protect what she loved most in this world. Two Eagle's voice grew harder as he continued, revealing that the soldiers had specifically targeted the children, loading them into wagons like sacks of grain while the camp burned around them. And only this one child had been found alive, placed deliberately on Jake's doorstep like a message written in blood and desperation. Someone wanted us to find him here, wanted us to believe you had taken him, wanted Apache blood to water your land while they watched from safety and counted their profits, the chief said, his eyes narrowing as understanding dawned that they had both been played as pawns in someone else's deadly game. Jake felt the pieces falling into place like stones building a wall, realized that his cabin had been chosen not randomly, but with careful calculation by someone who understood that saving an Apache child would mark him for death while providing the perfect excuse for massacre. Both men stood in the growing light of morning, connected now not by the hatred that had defined their people's relationship, but by the shared recognition that they had been manipulated by forces that cared nothing for justice or mercy, only for the profits that came from keeping good men at each other's throats, while innocents paid the price in blood and tears. Two Eagle's voice dropped to the low rumble of distant thunder as he spoke the name that had haunted Apache nightmares for 3 seasons, Colonel Morrison, letting the syllables fall between them like drops of poison that contaminated everything they touched, while his weathered features hardened into the expression of a man who had finally seen the true face of his enemy. Morrison wanted you to kill my grandson, or wanted us to kill you for taking him. Either way, clearing the path for what he really seeks, Two Eagles explained, his broken English carrying the weight of terrible understanding as he gestured toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants around Jake's valley. The railroad men pay him gold for every acre of Apache land he clears, pay him more gold for every white settler who abandons his claim after Indian troubles, and your homestead sits exactly where they want to lay their iron roads, through the heart of our sacred hunting grounds. Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet as the truth crashed over him like an avalanche of ice and stone, understanding finally why his cattle had been killed and left to rot, why Apache arrows had been found near his property after attacks he never witnessed, why every peaceful overture between the peoples had ended in bloodshed that served no one except the men in fine suits who drew lines on maps in distant cities. Morrison has been playing us against each other like pieces on a chessboard, using our hatred to blind us to his real purpose, Jake said, his voice thick with the bitter taste of being used as a tool in someone else's scheme for wealth and power. The colonel had orchestrated every attack, every reprisal, every escalation that had turned neighbors into enemies, and transformed a valley that could have supported both peoples into a killing ground where trust died alongside hope. Two Eagles nodded grimly, explaining how Morrison's soldiers had worn Apache war paint during attacks on white settlements, how they had used army rifles to kill Apache hunters, and left evidence pointing toward territorial disputes, how they had carefully cultivated the hatred that would justify any atrocity committed in the name of progress and profit. Your cabin was chosen because you are known as a fair man, because Apache death at your hands would shock the territory into demanding our complete removal, while your death at our hands would bring the full weight of the cavalry down upon our remaining camps. Two Eagles continued, his words painting a picture of manipulation so complete and cynical that it took Jake's breath away. The atmosphere between them shifted like wind changing direction before a storm, the tension of confrontation, giving way to the uneasy recognition that they had both been dancing to another man's tune while their children paid the price for his ambition. Jake looked down at the infant in his arms, seeing now not just a life saved but a conspiracy exposed, understanding that this small bundle of flesh and blood represented the key to unraveling Morrison's carefully laid plans. We have been fools, dancing to his music while he counts his gold, but now we know the truth, and truth has a power all its own when wielded by men who have nothing left to lose except their honor. The thunder of 20 horses echoed across the valley like the drums of war as Colonel Morrison crested the ridge with his cavalry, expecting to find Jake's cabin burned and his body scalped, expecting to discover the perfect justification for the final Apache massacre that would clear every acre between here and the railroad's planned route through the mountains. Morrison's face, flushed with anticipation of victory and profit, drained to the color of old bones as he saw Jake standing alive and unharmed beside 2 eagles, saw 50 Apache warriors sitting their horses in perfect discipline rather than riding away with blood on their weapons and scalps on their belts. The colonel's shock lasted only a heartbeat before transforming into the cold rage of a man whose careful plans had crumbled like sand castles before an unexpected tide, his hand dropping to his saber as he realized that his pawns had somehow discovered they were being manipulated and had chosen alliance over the mutual destruction he had so carefully orchestrated. "You were supposed to be dead." Morrison snarled at Jake, his voice carrying the fury of thwarted greed and the desperation of a gambler whose marked cards had been exposed, while his soldiers shifted nervously in their saddles as they began to understand that something had gone terribly wrong with their mission. The colonel's mask of military honor fell away like autumn leaves in a winter wind, revealing the true face of a man who had built his fortune on the graves of innocents and saw no reason to stop now that his scheme had been uncovered by the very people he had tried to destroy. "Attack them all!" Morrison screamed at his men, his voice cracking with the hysteria of desperation as he drew his pistol and aimed it not at the warriors but at Jake, understanding that eliminating the witness to his conspiracy was now more important than maintaining any pretense of military justice. But 2 eagles moved with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, placing himself between Morrison's gun and Jake, while his warriors flowed into defensive positions around the cabin like water finding its natural course, their weapons finally raised and ready as the real enemy revealed himself. Jake found himself fighting shoulder to shoulder with men he had been taught to fear, his rifle cracking in harmony with Apache war cries as Morrison's soldiers, caught between conflicting loyalties and uncertain orders, hesitated just long enough for the defenders to gain the upper hand in a battle that would determine whether truth or corruption ruled this corner of the territory. The infant's cries rose above the gunfire, like a voice calling for sanity in a world gone mad, reminding everyone present that this fight was not about conquest or revenge, but about protecting the innocent from those who would sacrifice any life for gold and power. Morrison's betrayal had stripped away all pretense and revealed the conflict in its truest form. Not Apache against white or cavalry against warrior, but decent people of all colors standing together against the kind of evil that wears a uniform and speaks of duty while counting profits made from other people's blood and tears. The crack of Morrison's rifle cut through the morning air like thunder-splitting stone, and Jake saw the muzzle flash aimed directly at 2 eagles' heart, saw death flying toward the chief who had become something more than an unlikely ally in these desperate minutes of truth and gunfire. Without thought, without hesitation, Jake threw himself sideways into the bullet's path, feeling the lead tear through his shoulder like a white-hot brand as he knocked 2 eagles to the ground, their blood mingling in the dust, as the chief's eyes widened with the shock of a man witnessing courage that transcended every boundary his people had drawn between friend and enemy. 2 eagles returned that sacrifice within heartbeats, his tomahawk whistling through the air to bury itself in the chest of a soldier who had Jake dead in his sights, while his powerful hands dragged the wounded cowboy behind the shelter of an overturned wagon where they could reload and plan their next move in this deadly chess game. The infant's cries drifted from the cabin like a lighthouse beacon in a storm of violence, reminding both men that their fight was not about personal survival, but about protecting the future itself from those who would strangle it in its cradle for the sake of railroad profits and political advancement. Morrison's voice rose above the gunfire, high and shrill with the hysteria of a man watching his empire of lies collapse around him. As he screamed orders that half his remaining soldiers ignored, their loyalty cracking like ice in spring, as they began to understand they had been following a madman rather than a military leader. The colonel's descent into complete madness accelerated as he watched his carefully recruited mercenaries fall one by one to the combined fury of Apache warriors and one determined cowboy who refused to let evil triumph while he still drew breath. Morrison broke cover with the wild charge of a man who had nothing left to lose, his pistol trained not on the fighters who had ruined his plans, but on the cabin where an innocent child represented everything pure that his corruption could not touch or understand. Two Eagles and Jake moved as one man with two bodies, their partnership forged in the crucible of shared purpose as they intercepted Morrison's final desperate gambit, the chief's war cry harmonizing with Jake's roar of protective fury as they tackled the colonel just yards from the cabin door. The three men rolled in the dust like ancient gods locked in battle for the soul of the world, Morrison's fingernails clawing for his dropped weapon, while Jake and two Eagles fought to pin him down, to end his threat to the child who had become the living symbol of everything worth fighting for in a world that too often chose profit over human dignity. Above them, the sounds of battle faded as the remaining honest soldiers laid down their arms and Morrison's hired killers fled into the mountains, leaving only these three men to settle the final question of whether innocence would survive or perish in this remote corner of a territory where railroad barons played chess with human lives and called it progress. Morrison's final defeat arrived not through the blade of a tomahawk or the barrel of a rifle, but through the power of truth spoken loud enough for honest soldiers to hear. As the colonel's ravings about railroad profits and orchestrated massacres spilled from his lips like poison from a broken bottle, each confession another nail in the coffin of his military career and criminal conspiracy. The surviving cavalrymen, men who had joined the army to serve their country rather than line the pockets of corrupt officers, heard Morrison screaming about the gold he had earned for every dead Apache, every burned homestead, every family torn apart by the hatred he had carefully cultivated, like a farmer tending crops of violence and despair. Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran whose own son had died in one of Morrison's manufactured Indian attacks, slowly turned his rifle away from the Apache warriors and trained it on his commanding officer, his weathered face twisted with the disgust of a man discovering he had been serving evil while believing he fought for justice. One by one, Morrison's remaining soldiers followed Williams' lead, their weapons swinging toward the colonel who had betrayed everything they thought they stood for, their faces showing the sick realization that they had been dancing to the tune of a madman who saw human lives as nothing more than obstacles to his personal enrichment. Morrison's voice climbed to a shriek as he saw his own men turning against him, as he understood that his confessions had stripped away the last vestiges of military authority that had protected him from the consequences of his actions, leaving him naked before the judgment of soldiers who still believed in honor. Two Eagles rose slowly from the dust, his hand resting on his knife handle but making no move to draw the blade, his dark eyes studying Morrison with the calm assessment of a man who understood that some fates are worse than death, that living with the knowledge of your own cowardice and greed could be punishment enough for any soul still capable of shame. The chief spoke quietly to Sergeant Williams, explaining that Morrison should face the white man's justice in the white man's courts, that Apache honor demanded the guilty be given the chance to confess their crimes before the law, rather than dying quick and clean in the heat of battle. Jake, propped against the cabin wall with Two Eagles' own bandana pressed against his wounded shoulder, watched in amazement as Apache warriors who had ridden here seeking blood instead chose the harder path of mercy, understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. even when every instinct screamed for revenge. The warriors gathered around Jake with expressions of respect that cut deeper than any wound Morrison's bullets could inflict, their weathered hands reaching out to touch his shoulder, their voices speaking words of gratitude in Apache that needed no translation because courage was a language understood by all men regardless of the color of their skin or the gods they worshipped in their hearts. Two Eagles extended his scarred hand toward Jake with the solemnity of a treaty being signed between nations, his voice carrying the weight of generations, as he spoke the words that would transform enemies into family, inviting the wounded cowboy to share the fire and bread of his people as an honored friend whose courage had earned him a place among the Apache that no white man before him had ever achieved. The infant, now healthy and alert in his grandfather's strong arms, gurgled with the contentment of a child who had survived the valley of death and emerged into a world where love transcended the artificial boundaries that men drew between themselves based on nothing more substantial than the color of their skin or the language they spoke in prayer. Jake felt the honor of that invitation settle into his bones like warmth from a winter fire, understanding that he was being offered something precious beyond measure, acceptance into a brotherhood forged not by blood or birth, but by the choices a man makes when everything he values hangs in the balance, and he must decide who he truly is in the darkness of his soul. Behind him, his cabin stood silent and peaceful in the morning light, its weathered walls bearing witness to the night that had changed everything, and Jake realized he could have barricaded those doors and hidden until the storm passed, could have chosen the safety of neutrality over the dangerous path of moral courage that had nearly cost him his life. But as he watched two eagles cradle his grandson with the tenderness of a man who had thought he would never hold the child again, Jake understood that some moments define not just who we are but who we choose to become, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let innocence die on your watch when you have the power to save it. The empty basket sat forgotten by the cabin door, its woven fibers catching the golden light of sunrise, transformed from a vessel of desperation into a symbol of hope that would remind anyone who saw it that miracles still happen when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. Morrison would face military justice for his crimes. The railroad would have to find another route through mountains that would no longer echo with the screams of the innocent, and two communities that had been manipulated into hatred would begin the long journey toward understanding that their shared humanity was stronger than any force that sought to divide them. The morning breeze stirred the grass around Jake's boots as he prepared to follow two eagles toward a future none of them could have imagined when the sun first rose on this day of reckoning. And somewhere in the distance, the cry of an eagle soared above the mountains like a promise that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find its way to those brave enough to fight for it. You who hear this story, consider what basket might appear on your doorstep. What choice between safety and honor might present itself when you least expect it? What innocent life might depend on your willingness to stand between darkness and light when the whole world seems determined to look the other way?